Ariadne by Anton Chekhov. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Kirsten Ferreri. Tales of Chekhov, Volume 1. Translated by Constance Garnett. Ariadne. On the deck of a steamer sailing from Odessa to Sevastopol, a rather good-looking gentleman with a little round beard came up to me to smoke and said, "Notice those Germans sitting near the shelter? Whenever Germans or Englishmen get together they talk about the crops, the price of wool, or their personal affairs. But for some reason or other, when we Russians get together, we never discuss anything but women and abstract subjects, but especially women." This gentleman's face was familiar to me already. We had returned from abroad the evening before in the same train, and at Volotchisk, when the luggage was being examined by the customs, I saw him standing with a lady, his travelling companion, before a perfect mountain of trunks and baskets filled with ladies' clothes, and I noticed how embarrassed and downcast he was when he had to pay duty on some piece of silk frippery, and his companion protested and threatened to make a complaint. Afterwards, on the way to Odessa, I saw him carrying little pies and oranges to the ladies' compartment. It was rather damp. The vessel swayed a little, and the ladies had retired to their cabins. The gentleman with the little round beard sat down beside me and continued. "Yes, when Russians come together they discuss nothing but abstract subjects and women. We are so intellectual, so solemn, that we utter nothing but truths, and can discuss only questions of a lofty order. The Russian actor does not know how to be funny. He acts with profundity even in a farce. We're just the same. When we have got to talk of trifles, we treat them only from an exalted point of view. It comes from a lack of boldness, sincerity, and simplicity. We talk so often about women, I fancy, because we are dissatisfied. We take too ideal a view of women, and make demands out of all proportion with what reality can give us. We get something utterly different from what we want, and the result is dissatisfaction, shattered hopes, and inward suffering, and if anyone is suffering, he's bound to talk of it. It does not bore you to go on with this conversation?" "No, not in the least." "In that case, allow me to introduce myself," said my companion, rising from his seat a little. "Ivan Ilyitch Shamohin, a Moscow landowner of a sort. You I know very well." He sat down and went on, looking at me with a genuine and friendly expression. "A mediocre philosopher like Max Nordau would explain these incessant conversations about women as a form of erotic madness, or would put it down to our having been slave owners, and so on. I take quite a different view of it. I repeat, we are dissatisfied because we are idealists. We want the creatures who bear us and our children to be superior to us and to everything in the world. When we are young, we adore and poeticize those with whom we are in love. Love and happiness, with us, are synonyms. Among us in Russia, marriage without love is despised. Sensuality is ridiculed and inspires repulsion, and the greatest success is enjoyed by those tales and novels in which women are beautiful, poetical, and exalted. And if the Russian has been for years in ecstasies over Raphael's Madonna, or is eager for the emancipation of women, I assure you there is no affectation about it. But the trouble is that when we have been married or been intimate with a woman for some 2 or 3 years, we begin to feel deceived and disillusioned. We pair off with others, and again disappointment, again repulsion, and in the long run we become convinced that women are lying, trivial, fussy, unfair, undeveloped, cruel, in fact, far from being superior, are immeasurably inferior to us men. And in our dissatisfaction and disappointment there is nothing left for us but to grumble and talk about what we've been so cruelly deceived in." While Shamohin was talking, I noticed that the Russian language and our Russian surroundings gave him great pleasure. This was probably because he had been very homesick abroad. Though he praised the Russians and ascribed to them a rare idealism, he did not disparage foreigners, and that I put down to his credit. It could be seen, too, that there was some uneasiness in his soul, that he wanted to talk more of himself than of women, and that I was in for a long story in the nature of a confession. And when we had asked for a bottle of wine, and had each of us drunk a glass, this was how he did, in fact, begin. "I remember in a novel of Weltman's someone says, 'So that's the story,' and someone else answers, 'No, that's not the story, that's only the introduction to the story.' In the same way, what I've said so far is only the introduction. What I really want to tell you is my own love story. Excuse me, I must ask you again. It won't bore you to listen." I told him it would not, and he went on. "The scene of my story is laid in the Moscow province in one of its northern districts. The scenery there, I must tell you, is exquisite. Our homestead is on the high bank of a rapid stream where the water chatters noisily day and night. Imagine a big old garden, neat flower beds, beehives, a kitchen garden, and below it a river with leafy willows, which, when there is a heavy dew on them, have a lustreless look as though they had turned grey, and on the other side a meadow, and beyond the meadow on the upland a terrible dark pine forest. In that forest delicious red agarics grow in endless profusion, and elks still live in its deepest recesses. When I am nailed up in my coffin, I believe I shall still dream of those early mornings, you know, when the sun hurts your eyes, or those wonderful spring evenings when the nightingales and the landrails call in the garden and beyond the garden, and sounds of the harmonica float across from the village, where they play the piano indoors and the stream babbles. When there is such music, in fact, that one wants at the same time to cry and to sing aloud. We have not much arable land, but our pasture makes up for it, and with the forest yields about 2,000 roubles a year. I am the only son of my father. We are both modest persons, and with my father's pension that sum was amply sufficient for us. The first 3 years after finishing at the university I spent in the country, looking after the estate and constantly expecting to be elected on some local assembly. But what was most important, I was violently in love with an extraordinarily beautiful and fascinating girl. She was the sister of our neighbor Kotlovitch, a ruined landowner who had on his estate pineapples, marvelous peaches, lightning conductors, a fountain in the courtyard, and, at the same time, not a farthing in his pocket. He did nothing, and knew how to do nothing. He was as flabby as though he had been made of boiled turnip. He used to doctor the peasants by homeopathy and was interested in spiritualism. He was, however, a man of great delicacy and mildness, and by no means a fool, but I have no fondness for these gentlemen who converse with spirits and cure peasant women by magnetism. In the first place, the ideas of people who are not intellectually free are always in a muddle, and it's extremely difficult to talk to them. And secondly, they usually love no one and have nothing to do with women, and their mysticism has an unpleasant effect on sensitive people. I did not care for his appearance either. He was tall, stout, white-skinned, with a little head, little shining eyes, and chubby white fingers. He did not shake hands, but kneaded one's hands in his, and he was always apologizing. If he asked for anything, it was "excuse me"; if he gave you anything, it was "excuse me too." As for his sister, she was a character out of a different opera. I must explain that I had not been acquainted with the Kotlovitches in my childhood and early youth, for my father had been a professor at N., and we had for many years lived away. When I did make their acquaintance, the girl was 22, had left school long before, and had spent 2 or 3 years in Moscow with a wealthy aunt, who brought her out into society. When I was introduced, and first had to talk to her, what struck me most of all was her rare and beautiful name, Ariadne. It suited her so wonderfully. She was a brunette, very thin, very slender, supple, elegant, and extremely graceful, with refined and exceedingly noble features. Her eyes were shining too, but her brother's shone with a cold sweetness, mawkish as sugar candy, while hers had the glow of youth, proud and beautiful. She conquered me on the first day of our acquaintance, and indeed it was inevitable. My first impression was so overwhelming that to this day I cannot get rid of my illusions. I am still tempted to imagine that nature had some grand, marvelous design when she created that girl. Ariadne's voice, her walk, her hat, even her footprints on the sandy bank where she used to angle for gudgeon filled me with delight and a passionate hunger for life. I judged of her spiritual being from her lovely face and lovely figure, and every word, every smile of Ariadne's bewitched me, conquered me, and forced me to believe in the loftiness of her soul. She was friendly, ready to talk, gay and simple in her manners. She had a poetic belief in God, made poetic reflections about death, and there was such a wealth of varying shades in her spiritual organization that even her faults seemed in her to carry with them peculiar, charming qualities. Suppose she wanted a new horse and had no money, what did that matter? Something might be sold or pawned, or if the steward swore that nothing could possibly be sold or pawned, the iron roofs might be torn off the lodges and taken to the factory, or at the very busiest time the farm horses might be driven to the market and sold there for next to nothing. These unbridled desires reduced the whole household to despair at times, but she expressed them with such refinement that everything was forgiven her, all things were permitted to her, as to a goddess or to Caesar's wife. My love was pathetic, and was soon noticed by everyone, my father, the neighbours, and the peasants, and they all sympathized with me. When I stood workmen vodka, they would bow and